Each one of you is gravely charged with safeguarding part of the living soul of this city, our trees.
I implore the council to evaluate the housing crisis and ask themselves whether or not retaining trees is a higher priority than providing more homes to their citizens.
Well, those are two of the many different public comments on a new tree ordinance the city of Seattle is wrestling over this week. So how can the city balance its need to build more affordable housing with the need to preserve and grow its tree canopy? Plus, should the Seattle Police Department apologize for its role in the Black Lives Matter protests from 2020? And also, what happens now that the legislature has fallen short on its role to fix our state's broken drug possession law? Will all drugs be legal in our state starting July 1st? A lot of questions here. We are discussing those stories and so much more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. If you haven't voted in the special election yet for King County and you're hearing this on Tuesday, get that ballot in right now for the Crisis Care Center's levy, please. I am Brian Callanan here. I'm a host on Seattle Channel here. The views expressed are mine, all mine. And with me once again is my co-host, David Croman, transportation reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I got to break this down with you. It's not that I completely understand the sport of hockey. I never thought I'd follow it all that closely, but danged if I wasn't yelling at the TV this week and watching the Kraken win in overtime.
Yeah, I'm not a hockey follower, but I've been watching the playoffs a little bit. It's fun. I'm happy to hop on the bandwagon. Can't say that I'm going to stay on the bandwagon permanently. We'll see, but it's fun.
Right. Yeah, it seems like there's room so far, so I'm taking it. Well, David, thank you, as always, for joining me here. And also, thank you to our background noise sponsor out there, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Thanks also to our show patrons. We really need your support here, folks. If you're a listener, please do become a patron. The Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker campaign is off and rolling. We'd love to have you on board as a supporter of the show. You can get your very own decal here. $5 a month pledge there. Make it happen, folks. I sent a sticker out to a number of people recently. Angie, Cindy, looking at you here. Send an email our way with a photo of that sticker in action. Seattle News, Views, and Brews at gmail.com. Thanks finally to Converge Media. We partner with Converge for the video version of this podcast. Check it out on Converge's YouTube channel, Wednesdays at 7. Off we go with right here, right now. All right, David, let's talk trees here. Seattle is trying to hit the reset button on its tree ordinance. The city really hasn't revised this law since about 2008. City leaders say it needs some fixing. I'll give you some quick background here, folks. We've lost 255 acres of trees, according to a recent 5-year study, and Seattle is determined to increase its tree canopy up to 30% coverage by the year 2037. We're sitting at about 28% right now. How are they going to do that? Well, by putting new restrictions on which trees can be cut and also setting up some one-to-one replacement strategies or in lieu fines when trees get cut for developers building new housing. That is just a fraction of what is covered in 50 pages worth of legislation on this. More than 100 amendments are flying around as we speak. David, I recently did a show on this topic on Seattle Channel on our City Inside Out program. And what I really noticed was that no one was really happy here. Developers are saying this law is going to make building houses more expensive, continue to drive up prices. Tree preservationists say this doesn't go far enough. We won't make our tree goal with this new law either. How do you look at this battle over tree legislation?
Yeah, it's hard for me to see it as not a sort of proxy for the housing conversation because it has material effects on who can build housing and where and at what price. And so, at its most basic, it is about how many trees there are in Seattle. But, the focus tends to be on, developers and their role or housing when, I think not all of the trees that have been lost are due to housing necessarily.
No, a bunch of them, if I can jump in, a bunch of them were on public land. We're talking about parks and stuff like that too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and this is a lot of these trees are planted by people, many, many decades ago, and trees die. They need to be replaced. The sort of stark example is the cherry trees down near Pike Place. But, I think there are a lot of examples of that. And, if trees aren't sort of trimmed, then you have tragic consequences. There was someone who died in Seward Park a few years ago.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why tree canopy sort of shrinks and grows and things like that, but the focus tends to fall on housing, which I think is why this ends up becoming as sort of charged as it is.
Yeah.
I mean, I point this out usually when we talk about the tree canopy, which is, the decisions that Seattle makes around housing and density also has effects on the tree canopy outside of Seattle. If it's harder, if there's less housing in Seattle, then there's more demand for housing outside of Seattle. And, there's an example down the road for me where about 200 acres of second growth forest were logged to build, a new neighborhood development. Maybe that was always going to happen that way, but part of it is, I'm out in Kingston. Part of it is people who maybe otherwise would have lived in Seattle, and there's more pressure for housing out here, and so trees get cut down. So it's always interesting when you talk about tree canopy in this sort of as if there are, in a Seattle specific way, when we all know that trees generally are not, they don't really care about city boundaries.
Yeah.
So Seattle's decisions have impact elsewhere too.
Agreed. And I think you're raising an important issue here, David, also with equity, because I think another big focus for the city is when you say where are these trees actually growing or where are they getting cut down, it really does seem like some of the areas that are less affluent. And I'm talking about parts of South Seattle here. There are fewer trees there, and the impacts when we talk about climate, when we talk about that heat dome that we had a couple years ago, those temperatures were markedly and measuredly higher in those neighborhoods where there were fewer trees, less money, that sort of a thing. So I think the city's trying to respond to that too, which makes this balancing act even more difficult when you really start pinpointing areas like that. Your thoughts on this whole idea of tree equity and where trees are built, because it turns into an issue of, some people call it climate injustice, and I think that's a part of the equation too.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think of Greg Spotts, the SDOT director. That was kind of one of his big initiatives when he was in Los Angeles, was around this. And, if you look at the data, it is pretty stark. A lot of that, too, is those areas tend to have bigger arterials and, Rainier Avenue, I think of cutting through a lot of the neighborhoods, or Martin Luther King Way, or, so it's not just about housing. And certainly, I don't know that anyone is opposed to adding more trees in places that need them. It just gets a little tricky when it becomes a sort of impact fee on the cost of building new housing to protect or add new trees. But yeah, certainly. I mean, and I think that question around heat inequities is going to get more and more pronounced with each every summer. I mean, it's been hot and smoky, and having a tree nearby is a minor reprieve from that.
Right. It can turn into an issue with flooding too. So a lot still ahead with this one, folks. The council has a lot of work ahead of it, hopes to have this voted out of committee and before the full council for a vote in mid-May. So we'll keep an eye on what's going on there. I wanted to talk about another issue that the council is taking up this week in the Public Safety Human Services Committee here, David, establishing some pay equity guidelines for human service providers through a resolution they're working on. I always get a little leery about resolutions because they're not as legally binding as a city ordinance. And I'm wondering, what does it really mean to have a new resolution on the books that says we are planning on paying our human service workers more? I just wanted to throw that out there, David. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm sort of with you on this. Resolutions are always, sometimes they're sort of a way of laying out a plan. Resolutions for spending money, and that has some power to it. But when you talk about sort of a plan to make a plan, it gets a little squishier. They have been there. This question of how much human services workers are paid has, I remember writing a story about this in 2017, I think, from City Hall, and it hasn't really happened. So if I'm a human services worker, I don't know that I'm going to put a lot of faith in a resolution when this conversation is not new. It's also interesting, I think this kind of ties, this is public safety related. I do think this kind of ties into when we have questions around alternatives to policing or who else might respond to mental health crises instead of police. A lot of times the answer to that is seen as human services workers, but the reality is police get paid handsomely, or fairly, I suppose. But human services workers, these are people with oftentimes social work degrees and student debt, and they're being paid less than you would make at Starbucks if you worked there. So if the goal is to actually create meaningful alternatives to police, it's sort of hard to imagine creating that workforce based on what they're currently paid.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it has a lot of overlay with different issues, David. Bringing up public safety is a great example, but I think housing too. And with the Seattle housing levy that I know the council is going to be pushing for this fall, so many of these different projects not only include, okay, we're going to build this housing, but also these wraparound services that come with a lot of these places. And when you talk about those services, these are the service workers you're talking about. So when the city is promising, here's what we're going to do in terms of affordable housing, and then they don't have the staff to actually back that up, I think that turns into a concern with a number of these big issues, public safety and housing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you think of the crisis care center levy that's being voted on today.
Yeah.
There's another example of, I mean, it's not just human services. It's pretty much every industry right now.
Yeah.
Ambitions are curbed by lack of workforce. But human services is particularly salient just because it's such a difficult job. And it just pays so badly. It's just the turnover is pretty incredible, and you can't blame that. You can't blame people for feeling ideological and wanting to make a difference, and then quickly burning out and struggling to just pay rent. You can understand why there is so much churn. Yeah, difficult job, and the dollars are not great. Thank you, David, for that. And folks, we're going to move on to our next part of the show here. What happened to the legislature's promise to fix our state's broken drug possession law, the Blake Bill, as it was called? We're looking into how this vote fell apart, what happens now, with an upcoming deadline that could make for some very interesting legal challenges. That's next on Now Hear This. For all of the major pieces of legislation passed out of the legislature this session, the assault weapons ban, missing middle housing, to name a few, Olympia came up short on a fix to our drug possession law. The Blake decision from 2 years ago from the Supreme Court that ruled the felony drug possession law on the books in our state was unconstitutional pushed the legislature at that time to make a temporary 2-year fix, making drug possession a misdemeanor. But that fix expires at the beginning of July, which set up 2023 as the session for a more permanent answer to Blake. But after months of wrangling, it fell through, and drugs could be legal in our state on July 1st. Governor Inslee not happy about it. He made these comments right after the final day of the session on Sunday about the need for lawmakers to come together and what might be a call for a special session.
We need more votes, and we need to hammer out a bill that can pass. That needs to happen before July 1st, because at that point we would not have a law on the books. So it is our expectation legislators will get to work on this and get this job done. Anything else is not acceptable to the state of Washington.
So in the end, this died in the state house. No Republicans voted for the final legislative package. 15 Democrats voted against it too. So the supermajority for the Dems could not deliver, and we have a mess on our hands. David, a lot of push and pull on this one between, do we need more drug treatment? Do we need to make sure there's some sort of punishment involved if the treatment isn't completed here? A lot happening with this. But it seems like the governor is saying, okay, before I pull the trigger on calling for a special session, we'd better make sure the votes are there. That was my takeaway from this.
Yeah, and the response from, I can't remember if it was, I think it was Andy Billig on the Democrat side, responding to the possible call for a special session, basically saying, we've been talking about this for 100 days,
right?
And we're here now. Didn't inspire a lot of confidence that a special session would necessarily end any differently. That said, this compromise bill that was voted down only showed up on Saturday, so it's not that specific bill. I mean, they've been talking about this forever, but that specific bill was only around for 24, 36 hours for review and negotiation, at least on the public level. So I suppose that there's perhaps and I think some Democrats were surprised that no Republicans voted for it, because it looks like at least 3 had voted for something similarly.
They had before.
So I don't know what the path is on a special session. I think for right now, what we're left with is likely to be, as the cliche has been, a patchwork, and I think that's probably accurate. That what we would see in the event that a bill isn't passed is different drug laws for different jurisdictions, which is going to get hairy pretty quickly, because you've got a cocaine in your car or something, and you get or whatever it might be, cocaine in your pocket in Seattle, and you step into Shoreline, and suddenly you're liable for arrest. I mean, that I don't know that anyone loves systems like that where the difference between 150th Street and 151st Street is arrest versus nothing. That's pretty tough. So, but I think if nothing happens, that's probably the reality we get. And I don't. And the Shoreline example is not a hypothetical one.
No,
the Snohomish County member has already announced he will introduce legislation to recriminalize drug possession. I have not heard anything from the Seattle City Council or the King County Council so far. So it's highly possible that you literally have that exact example be reality. Larger picture, I'd be curious. I think this would be good follow-up reporting. I'd be curious to know, in the last 2 years, how many people have actually been arrested for just pure drug possession,
like on its own.
Even before,
it's usually not the solo charge involved here, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Even before Blake, I just think that was exceedingly rare that people would get real jail time just for drug possession. It was almost always a means for prosecutors to add on a little time to a sentence, perhaps, but there was almost always something else. So I don't know that it's the difference being that suddenly all these people who would have been arrested are going to go, walk free, because selling drugs is still illegal. Trafficking in drugs is still illegal.
Yes.
What it does mean, though, is when you're thinking about plea deals and sentencing and things like that I think what this does is really shakes up the courtroom. Yeah. As far as sort of leverage on the prosecutor side, what they have to bargain with and throw at defendants. Yeah, and interesting to see too cities like Bellingham coming out with a law that says, okay, we're not going to criminalize possession, but we are going to criminalize the public use of it. So it almost turns into an issue like that too, I think, in some ways, in terms of, okay, what are we seeing publicly? We talk about this a lot with homelessness for sure, but I wonder if that whole conversation over drug use ends up going in that direction. Again, I feel like what Bellingham is doing is very much a Band-Aid on the situation and doesn't offer the treatment that is certainly part of that follow-up. But I was interested to see that come out of Bellingham there, and I wonder how that shapes this discussion too in terms of what cities and counties do. Yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting, and I think we've heard from Mayor Bruce Harrell. I think we're going to see increasingly more renewed interest on what fentanyl and what can be done to turn back fentanyl, because it's just really. I mean, my colleagues have been writing about it a little bit, and I think are going to continue to write about it, which is just fentanyl has really, the number of other people dying from fentanyl is pretty astounding, and how quickly it has grown. And so I do think that alone kind of changes progressive cities' calculus around what they want to do with drugs, how they go about that. I don't know. But, if nothing is struck on Blake, I guess it wouldn't actually even surprise me if even Seattle looks for a sort of Bellingham-esque path. The issue here is that the Blake bill did have money for treatment, as you mentioned. And so that gets a lot harder for cities that are already looking at budget shortfalls pretty universally to imagine kind of setting up treatment options. And, Seattle is not really in the treatment business. It's more of a county thing. So it just, again, you get into patchwork and who has authority over what, who has money to do that. It gets hairy quickly. Yeah, and who has the treatment services and all that too. So, I'm fascinated to see where this goes next, and fascinated to see if the Dems are going to try to draw in those 15 votes that were no on this one, because I think a few of those votes that were no were saying, this gross misdemeanor idea, which is basically what they had settled on Sunday, the final day of the session there. They weren't okay with that. A lot of Democrats saw that as a return to the war on drugs. So a lot of rhetoric flying around here. We'll see what settles out over the next several weeks here, but interested to see what a special session might bring, if indeed that is called here. All right, well, moving on, in case you missed it, an interesting report last week from the City Office of the Inspector General, one of several oversight agencies monitoring the Seattle Police Department. They put out their fourth and final Sentinel report, as it's called. These reports have been detailing some of the issues arising from the George Floyd protests of 2020, what the SPD was doing during that time. And there's been some media buzz, David, from this report about the idea that the SPD should apologize for its action. The line in the report says this: acknowledge the harm to BIPOC community
caused by Seattle police actions over time and issue a public apology for the actions of Seattle police during the 2020 protest. Now, for the record, Chief Diaz did apologize to anyone who lost trust in the department. That was back in 2021. He said he was deeply sorry. This was an open letter that went to the federal court as well. But it just had me thinking about this issue writ large, David. Is an apology truly what's needed from the SPD in the spirit of reform? Some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I don't know. It's sticky. Part of me feels like we're going to be thinking about how they responded to that those protests for a while. We already have. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I don't know sort of what that actually accomplishes. Who would hear that apology? And my sense is the people to whom that apology is directed. I don't know that it would actually sort of change anything about how they feel about Seattle Police Department and specifically how it responded to those protests. I would be curious to know how the officers would feel about its department apologizing to protesters, because we still see this sort of. I think it's hard to ignore that there's a bit of a cultural divide between some members of the police department and some citizens of Seattle. Mike Solon, the SPOG president, is sort of the most stark example of that. And so, it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting gesture. I don't know if it's going to happen. I would also think maybe there, whenever, I don't know what kind of outstanding legal cases are still being deliberated, but anyone who follows sort of liability knows that, if you apologize for something publicly, it's basically an admission of guilt. And so I don't know that they will too, because if there are cases outstanding, that certainly would complicate them. If they have the police chief on record apologizing for how they responded, that's pretty good evidence for anyone who's still litigating injuries that they may have sustained. So I don't know what Seattle Police Department does with that recommendation. I haven't heard anything yet. My sense is they kind of probably just want to move on from it, and are probably going to bank on just kind of waiting it out. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like, too, David, to be fair, the SPD has made some changes since that time in 2020. They've instituted some new policies when it comes to crowd control, et cetera. Now, have we had the real test of those policies over the past couple of years? No, but I'll be very interested to see what happens here, because 5 recommendations in this final report. The SPD has to respond to this and respond to the federal court overseeing the consent decree here by July 31st. So I'm interested to see what happens next there, and I'm not exactly sure if an apology is going to be part of it or not. But anyway, some interesting back and forth on that Sentinel report, and I appreciate you talking with me about it. All right, so coming up, some legal action unfolding over Metro Transit drivers speaking their native language. David's got the details on this interesting story on Transportation Talk. David, you had a story recently in the Seattle Times about Metro Transit workers being ordered to speak their native language only in private. 2 Metro workers have now sued the agency in what they're calling a case of language discrimination. Can you break down what happened here?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. These 2 longtime Metro supervisors sort of working in proximity to each other. One of them, it's pretty simple interaction, wanted the other one to print something off for him off the computer, but they're both from Ethiopia originally, and so he had the conversation in Amharic, their native language, and apparently somebody in proximity complained about that and said that it made them feel uncomfortable, and it appears that the bosses didn't apply a lot of scrutiny to that complaint, and therefore ordered these 2 employees to speak Amharic only in private. It's an interesting lawsuit because there wasn't a lot of dispute over the facts. I mean, both sides admit that this is exactly what happens. Sometimes in kind of employment law or employment cases like this, it's sort of murky, but this one, the Metro said that this was an unfortunate decision. The EEO report that was commissioned came down pretty hard on the supervisors for making this ask, because it, basically implied that these people's nationalities were less welcome in the workforce than others. Called it a fairly clear-cut case of discrimination on both subjective and objective measures. So, it's not a great look. I mean, Metro says this is a one-off. This doesn't reflect the culture. There's no blanket order not to speak native languages, but the fact that it got as far as it did was, is why we are where we are with these two folks filing this lawsuit, which, I don't know, my hunch is because you've got this EEO report and this statement from Metro saying it was unacceptable. It would surprise me if it didn't end in some kind of settlement, frankly.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of settlement. And I looked into a handful of different cases there with language discrimination. This is a serious thing. I mean, you don't want to be a public agency that tangles with this because it can get very real and very expensive. So I guess I hear what you're saying. The idea being, okay, let's settle this, let's put it behind us, and then try to put some policies in place such that we don't do this again. Is that the path you're seeing here, David?
Yeah, and that was one of the demands of this lawsuit, is a sort of explicit policy stating that you're not allowed to bar people from speaking their native language at work, especially to one another. So yeah, I mean, and I think the language in particular that was used around this is sort of a red flag. Being called unprofessional.
Yes.
Why is Amharic considered unprofessional? Versus, there's lots of people who are speaking languages at work. So, we'll see if it's a one-off or not. It wouldn't surprise me if Metro did implement some kind of more explicit policy around this as a result.
Yeah, and I saw some of the stats you had there that 22,000 people of Ethiopian ancestry are in the Seattle area. Almost 15,000 of them speak Amharic. So we are talking about a population that is growing within the city of Seattle, and I appreciated that report. David, I need to wrap up with you, my friend, and I thought it was so awesome, the story behind the story on the beaching of the ferry Walla Walla a few Saturdays ago. Several people on board were heading to a wedding, including the wedding photographer. They all missed the wedding, but it ended up the photographer set up a photo booth on the boat. What was going on there? That sounded so crazy.
Well, it was actually, so she was a wedding photographer heading to photograph a proposal at the Great Wheel, and a bunch of people on the boat were all dressed up to go to a Navy ball because
that's what it was. Okay.
Bremerton, of course, has a big Navy community. And so there's all these people, and this is a very formal event. So in, formal military dress and ballroom, gowns, formal gowns. And, so when it crashed or it stalled out, they all realized they weren't going to make it. This woman realized she was going to miss the, photograph of the people proposing, but thought it was sort of funny because everyone had their orange life preservers on. So thought it was sort of a funny contrast that all these people in ballroom gowns and tuxedos were also wearing orange life preservers. So started snapping photos and, I got numbers and sent people these photos. So, sort of as this woman told me, it was very much a make lemonade out of lemon situation.
Yeah, it will be a night they will never forget. That's for sure. And thank you for that report. I thought that was great. I look forward to more on what you're going to be reporting on with ferries and how we're going to pay for replacing these things, because I know that's the big story behind the story here. But I love that little one about the photo booth. So thank you, David, as always, and thank you for joining me. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might like to listen. Please find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and show your support. You can also watch us on Converge Media too. Thanks for doing that, and we will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.